Hey guys! This is part 7 of What If Naruto was the son of the Greek goddess Hera. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start.
We are pain, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 31. Zoe grabbed Issei by his shirt collar and started to violently shake him back and forth. Just what the Tartarus do you think you're doing stripping these women? Have you absolutely no decency or respect in your body at all? Give me one good reason why I shouldn't cut your balls off with a rusty spoon, ask my lady to transform you into the pig that you are, and then get you where you stand. Naruto quickly shouted, cool at Zoe. We need to complete this quest, then you can flay Issei if you still want to do so. For now, why don't you just smack him a couple of times? He quickly created a clone that headed over to the queen's throne to try and determine where the dart came from. At the same time, Naruto unsealed 2 blankets which he promptly gave to the imprisoned Amazons for modesty. Once Zoe was done smacking Issei, she turned to look at the Amazons and helped to adjust the blankets slightly so as to better preserve their modesty. The clone Naruto made dispersed just as Zoe made the last adjustment. Naruto called out, the angle of decent the dart that killed Queen Sabrina took shows that it was fired from the 2nd story of Queen's chamber somewhere above the door that's opposite the queen. Issei quickly hurried towards the center of the chamber, stopped, and then turned around so that he could look at the section of the wall Naruto mentioned. His eyes quickly scanned the frescoes and then he shook his head. There's no obvious hidden panel or peephole up there, Naruto. It looks like the assassin closed whatever opening they're using after they fired the dart. Zoe frowned and quickly added her opinion on the situation. The question that needs to be asked is whether the queen was the primary target of the assassin or if she was merely a means to try and kill us undetected. Naruto nodded his head and then turned to question the 2 Amazon captives. Alright ladies, I know things have gone to my uncle's furnace, but I need you to be honest with me. It's the only way that we'll be able to capture whoever really killed the queen and set off the battle we just had. Remember that Queen Sabrina was going to help me and my team to complete our quest before she was killed. We need to know 2 things. Did the queen have any enemies among your people, and what is on the other side of that wall on what looks like the 2nd story? The 2 Amazons turned to look at each other, silently stared at each other for a moment. They then sagged their shoulders, coming to a silent agreement. The Amazon closer to Naruto looked up at him with a defeated gaze and said there was some grumbling about a few of her policies, but no more than usual when it comes to royal edicts. No one in the nation spoke out against the queen. If someone truly felt she was doing a terrible job of being queen, then she would have challenged the queen to a duel to the death over the throne. Once the first Amazon finished speaking, the other one spoke. The 2nd floor on the other side of that wall is a corridor that leads to a few of the offices we used to run. However, there is supposed to be at least 3 feet of brick between the side of the wall with the frescoes and the side that's attached to the corridor. Naruto nodded his head and tossed a roll of dollar coins to Issei. He then said, alright. I'm going to check to see if there are any hollow spaces in the wall where an assassin could hide. Issei, I want you to put a coin in the mouth of every Amazon that died in here so that the ferryman will get them across the river ASAP. The leader of the quest then started to walk up the wall and tapping it. Naruto's search was soon successful when he heard a hollow sound after tapping the fresco of Aphrodite's head. He double-checked and called out, we've got a hollow space here. Zoe smirked when she heard that news. Then, without any concern for the room's market value, Naruto punched the wall, smashing in Aphrodite's head. He pulled back his fist and grabbed onto the hole he had made. Then Naruto ripped off a strip of drywall 3 feet long and a foot wide. The drywall was casually thrown to the floor so that it landed on an empty spot. 3 more pieces of plaster drywall quickly joined the first on the floor to reveal a small chamber and wall big enough for a person to stand in and move about a foot left or right. There was also a small ladder built into the chamber leading up into a tunnel just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Naruto quickly entered the chamber, sent some chakra to his nose, and sniffed. While nowhere near an Inuzuka's sense of smell, the half-blood was able to smell that someone had been in this chamber recently. He then turned around and looked at the queen's chamber. This chamber offered a great view of the throne, and was close to where he estimated the dart came from. The assassin was shot the queen from here. Zoe, climb up on the wall near here and throw down some rope so that Issei can get up here as well. I'll go first up this ladder, then I want Issei to follow me with you holding the rear. The other two members of the quest quickly did as they were told. Zoe was happy to be going up the ladder last as she didn't want Issei looking at her rear. Naruto climbed up the ladder 3 stories until he got the end, which was an overhead door. He used a hand to steady himself, and then unsealed 2 flashbang tags. With the flashbangs in hand, Naruto quickly climbed to the end of the ladder, slammed his empty fist into the door, throwing it off its hinges, and threw the flashbangs into the opening. His free hands rapidly grabbed the ladder bars and used them to launch himself through the opening. As soon as Naruto was through the opening, he twisted 180 degrees and looked at his surroundings as he landed on the ceiling. The tunnel apparently led into some sort of closed office space where there were currently half a dozen Amazons disoriented from the flashbangs. While Issei and Zoe climbed out of the tunnel, Naruto started creating seals to barricade the room. Naruto called out, "Tie everyone up and we'll sort them out in a moment." Once Naruto was done creating the needed seals, he launched them to the doors and windows to seal to the room. He looked around, double-checking for any more hidden exits, and then looked to see who needed to be secured. The 6 Amazons had all been standing close to the hidden door that the quest members had poured out of, allowing Zoe and Issei to quickly secure them. Naruto stopped gripping the ceiling with his chakra and twisted around in mid-fall to land on his feet. Issei said, "Okay Naruto, what's the plan now?" Naruto turned to Zoe and said, "You're not going to like this next part, Zoe. However, we're going to use some psychological warfare to get these Amazons to talk. Please remember that these will just be threats, and not anything that will happen." A look of confusion crossed Zoe's face for a moment as she tried to figure out what Naruto was implying. Her eyes widened in shock as realization hit her. She then hissed out, "What the Tartarus are you thinking?" Naruto cut Zoe off by putting 2 fingers on her mouth. He then whispered, "Don't say anything, Zoe, or our captives might hear you. Fear is the interrogator's greatest tool, so please just trust me." He then turned to Issei and said in Yar Germanic, "Follow my lead when I interrogate the Amazons, but don't actually do anything. Is that understood, Issei?" Issei nodded his head with a slightly confused look on his face. He wasn't sure what Naruto was planning, but trusted that his friend knew what he was doing. The leader of the quest started to let out a little bit of killing intent to make things uncomfortable. The intensity of the killing intent was slowly increased, and after a minute or so it woke up the now very concerned Amazons. When the Amazons woke up, they quickly realized that they were bound with a very menacing appearing Naruto standing before them. Naruto was enhancing the fear he was creating in the Amazons by using a minor genjutsu, one of the few he could pull off, that was reserved to interrogating civilian targets. This particular genjutsu was completely useless against anyone with basic ninja training, and so was kept for use on civilians. One of the Amazons started to speak. "What is?" She was cut off by a hard smack to the face by Naruto's backhand. The sound of the smack quickly got all of the Amazons' complete attention on Naruto. To help with the illusion he was projecting, Naruto focused his disgust at what he was doing into an image of disgust with the Amazons. He mercilessly said, "You worms have got me on a very bad day. I came to the Amazons to get your people's help in completing a quest that the Fates themselves personally came to me with for the safety of the West. Now I'm all for asking for help when it is needed, and I'm willing to put up with a lot to get the help needed when the occasion calls for it. However, one of you worms went and totally ruined my day and made this quest significantly harder by killing Queen Sabrina. Having to kill allies because of what I can only determine is an internal power squabble pisses me off like my uncle's affairs piss off my mother. I can only conclude that at least one of you worms is the assassin, since the tunnel the assassin uses leads right here. That means one of you is responsible for this complication, and thus that worm's life is worth less than the dog shit I scrape off of my boots." Naruto used his thumb to point to Issei, who was standing nearby. "Issei here is one of my companions for this quest selected by the Fates themselves. He's a very good fighter, but he also happens to have libido that rivals my thunderous uncle without the restraint that said uncle has learned over the millennia. I had to personally guarantee to Artemis herself my third companion's safety on this quest when the Fates also required the aid of a hunter. Now I'm bringing this little fact up because unlike Zoe here, none of you have my protection from Issei's designs on your noble bodies." To add extra emphasis to his threat, Naruto used a little wind chakra manipulation to cut the Amazon's clothes, making them more revealing without being indecent. The genjutsu Naruto had cast was turned up to its full effects, as he remained silent for a time to let the full effect of his words sink in. Terror was starting to show in the Amazons' eyes as they started to clearly see Naruto's threat being carried out in their imaginations. Naruto was also using the silence to calm himself and to keep the bile from rising in his stomach. He could throw up after the interrogation was over. Interrogating was never tasteful, but at least when you used fear the target broke quicker. Once the Amazon's fear was at an appropriate level, Naruto completed his plan. I am willing to be merciful to you worms, as it is the assassin who has really pissed me off. Tell me who she is and she alone will be turned over to Issei once I am done the questioning. You will have 15 seconds after I am done talking to turn her over to me. If you do not, I will lead Zoe out of this room and let Issei enjoy your company. The 6 of you should be enough to calm him down for a few hours after he is finished. But it will be very frustrating for me to wait for you all to recover enough from him to answer my questions. As soon as Naruto stopped talking, 5 of the Amazons started to sing like a canary, just like he intended. Every Amazon except for one shouted out the name Cleo and gestured as best they could to the 6th Amazon. Cleo was understandably terrified and pissed at the predicament she was in. Naruto waited a few seconds and said, "Very well. I'll start questioning Cleo and then I'll turn her over to Issei alone if she is the assassin. However, I'm putting the rest of you in a form of forced sleep for the questioning. If you're trying to pull a fast one on me, then the joke's on you, because if you are sacrificing one of your number to hide the assassin, I will turn your bodies over to him anyway." Naruto unsealed some blank paper and slowly started to make the seals that would put the Amazons under. He was deliberately slow with the process to increase the Amazons' fear. It also allowed him to calm down a bit so that he could keep his features in the looks they needed to be for the interrogation. Once the tags were finished, he put them on the Amazons one by one until Cleo was the only Amazon conscious. Naruto grabbed Cleo, put her on a nearby desk, and slapped a seal he quickly unsealed onto her. He then pulled out a kunai in such a manner so that she could see him draw it, and see its razor-sharp edge reflected off of the room's light. Cleo's terror only grew worse as Naruto casually started to speak to her. "That seal I placed on you is fairly common where I grew up, and it's quite ingenious. You see, it stops all voluntary muscle movement below the neck. At the same time, it also sharpens your nerve sensitivity so that a little cut like this one." Naruto paused and made a shallow cut only a centimeter long on Cleo's arm. Once she stopped screaming, he continued, "The sensitivity magnifies the pain you receive so that a small cut like the one I just gave you feels like a mortal wound. Fortunately, the same method that enhances the pain you feel also keeps you from passing out from it." He then walked to Cleo's feet, lightly running the point of his kunai over her skin so that she knew it was there, but didn't actually feel any pain. Issei and Zoe had both moved out of view and turned away so that they didn't look at the torture Naruto was performing, and thus keep their stomach contents. The shinobi calmly cut off the Amazon's shoes and pulled her socks off to reveal her bare feet. He then said, "Each toe in the human foot is composed of 3 bones except for the big toe, which is composed of 2 bones. The human hand follows a similar composition with the fingers and thumb. That gives me 14 bones that can easily be cut off of your foot, Cleo. 28 bones if I have to use both of your feet, or 56 bones in all if I have to take the time to go through your fingers as well. Now that we've had that little lesson, let me explain a few things that will either help you out, or make your life even more hellish. I know that you killed Queen Sabrina, since a killer can always spot another killer. There is no chance of you diverting your fate to one of your companions. I will be asking you a series of questions which you will answer. Any attempt on your part to refuse to answer or to lie to me will result in you losing one of the bones of your toes or even your fingers if you're particularly stubborn. Once your fingers are gone, I will simply move on to pulling out your teeth one tooth at a time. On the flip side, if you do answer every one of my questions correctly and on time, I will place a seal on you that will numb your senses and prevent any chance of pregnancy before I turn you over to my companion." Cleo broke then and there, just as Naruto intended, much to his relief. Torture was the one aspect of his spy master training that Naruto absolutely despised and wished could be forgotten. However, even when one could steal valuable documents, observe enemy movements, or loosen a peon's tongue with a vice of choice, there were still times that you had to bite the bullet and put an enemy on the rack to get what was needed. No one ever said that doing what needed to be done would be pleasant or sit well with one's conscience. About the only good thing with Naruto's current situation besides the information Cleo was spewing was the fact that he could barely stop himself from puking his guts. That was good because it meant he was still a human being. It took half an hour for Naruto to ask all of his questions and write down Cleo's responses. As soon as he was done, he took out a sleeping seal and slapped it on her head. Once Cleo was out, Naruto stumbled over to a nearby trash can and started to puke. He kept heaving and heaving until there was nothing left for him to eject. Naruto then rolled over onto the floor with a queasy look on his face. Issei and Zoe walked over to Naruto, and Issei knelt down near his friend. The perverted Anis worriedly asked, "Naruto, are you going to be alright?" A groan came from the shinobi, and then he said, "Not for the rest of the day. Having to use torture to extract information always makes me sick to my stomach. I have the wrong mentality for that part of information gathering, just like my sensei. Issei, I'm sorry for using you in my interrogation. It's just that." Naruto paused for a second as he felt like he was going to throw up again. Once the feeling passed, he continued, "The genjutsu I used works best if you are as truthful as possible to the person you're torturing. Less chance of anyone's ability to detect lies revealing the genjutsu to them." Issei scowled and said, "That might be so, Naruto. But did you really have to drag my name through the mud like that? Just because my goal is to have a harem of buxom Valkyries when I move to Asgard does not mean I'm some sort of rapist. Helhium, Naruto, my mother would put me through the blood eagle if she thought I'd do something like that on a woman." Zoe was a bit confused as both Naruto and Issei shivered when Issei brought up the blood eagle. That particularly barbaric method of execution was one that they both hoped would stay buried in history. She eventually decided to let it go and asked the question that was on her mind in an icy tone. "Why did you threaten the Amazons with defilement?" Naruto was holding his stomach and looking extremely pitiful as he explained his actions. "Fear loosens tongues better than pain does, and rape is something that every woman fears. Since they were bound and completely at our mercy, that fear was being pulled to the surface. I was able to make that fear all-consuming through a mix of genjutsu, killing intent, and misleading words." A look of confusion appeared on the duo's faces. Naruto used his companion's confusion to allow him to turn over and slowly stand up while using a nearby desk to steady himself. "Remember when I said that my genjutsu works best when you're as truthful as possible? Well, the way to work around it is to lie by omission and use the truth you do reveal lead the target to a different conclusion. I did promise Artemis that I would protect you, Zoe, and Issei, you do have a libido that rivals my Uncle Z's. I was also truthful about everything I said except for turning them over to Issei. While I'm sure Issei wanted to look at the Amazons' bodies, they would take my statements and give them a much darker meaning. I reinforced this with Cleo by mentioning the seal as a reward, since I can create a seal that could numb her senses and prevent any chance of pregnancy while it is applied to a woman." Those answers placated Zoe and Issei somewhat, allowing Naruto to have more time to calm his stomach down. Even if the physical pain was minimal this time, the fact that he tortured the Amazons mentally still hurt the shinobi. It was times like these that made Naruto jealous of the Yamanaka clan, since they could just go into a person's mind to find the information they were looking for. If he ever got a member of that clan as a genin student, then that hypothetical student would get all of his spy master training. Once Naruto no longer looked like he was about to puke again, he quickly copied his notes on everything Cleo had revealed. It turned out that Cleo was working of a small group of Amazons who wanted to seize power from the queen and her supporters. Furthermore, they had gotten help from a group known only as Heptad in this venture. Cleo didn't know much about Heptad. Only that they provided her group with a series of untraceable poisons in exchange for some unmarked deliveries to Gifford Pinchot National Forest in Washington and to Las Vegas in Nevada. One of the deliveries had originally come from Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam, but Cleo didn't know where that package went. After all of the notes were copied, Naruto created a shadow clone and handed 2 copies over to it. The clone promptly headed over to the formerly secret exit and hopped down it. Issei quickly asked, "What is your clone doing with those notes?" Naruto turned to Issei and said, "He's going down to the queen's chamber to hand the notes over to the Amazons pounding at the doors. The plan is to adjust the barrier so that they can get partially into the room with the 2 Amazons we have bound down there returned as a sign of goodwill. Taichi willing, we'll be able to get out of here without having to kill more Amazons. I really don't want to have any more entries to make tonight." The trio of questers was able to get out of the Amazon compound after Naruto revealed the conspiracy to kill the queen to the Amazon guards who had been using an improvised battering ram on the queen's chamber door. However, it hadn't exactly been easy to get out of the Amazon's compound, since the trio had killed a room full of guards along with torturing several other Amazons. The trio had the good sense to stay sealed in the room where they found Cleo and simply sent Naruto's clones to negotiate with the Amazons until the guards swore an oath on the sticks to let them leave the compound unharmed. Of course, the Amazons didn't let the trio leave without giving a punishment, All three of them were banned from both the Amazon lands and from using for several centuries. They would have made it a lifetime ban, but Zoe was a member of the hunt, and they really didn't want to draw too much ire from Artemis. The hunters rarely used their services, so the Amazons figured they could get away with it, and such a ban would be effectively a lifetime ban for Issei and Naruto. Everyone on the quest decided to call it a day after they were free from the Amazons. They had found the first clue to finding the Yada no Kagami, and what they had found lined up with their interpretation of the prophecy so far. Currently, the trio was camping in a public camping ground just outside of Seattle so they could rest for the day. They could have pushed on to Washington to find the second clue, but that would have them going into an unknown situation tired at night. Zoe was currently alone at the trio's tents. Naruto had left the camping ground to go pick up something he deemed necessary from a nearby store. Issei was currently bothering some high school girls who were camping nearby. Zoe was using this time alone to think about Naruto and the new facts she had discovered about him today. Her lady's potential husband was an extremely complex and confusing person. How could a person calmly kill a room full of people and then turn around and pay Karen's fee for them? How does a person full of life turn themselves into a torturer and then gets physically sick from what they've done? Did she even know who the real Naruto Uzumaki was, or had she only seen a mask? What did the answer for these questions mean for her lady? The hunter's contemplation on her possible stepfather ended when she noticed Naruto returning to the camping ground with 2 large plastic bags. Zoe saw Naruto head towards the woods with the bags and decided to follow him. While she figured he probably was aware of her presence, he didn't call her out on being there. That was fine for her purposes. Once Naruto was away from everyone besides his shadow, he manipulated the mist to hide his presence from any mortal onlookers. The shinobi placed the 2 bags down on the ground and then used an earth jutsu to create a small altar. He quickly gathered some nearby fallen branches and placed them on the altar. After the last branch was in place, he then opened one of the bags to reveal an entire side of pork ribs. The ribs were gently placed on the wood-covered altar. Naruto knelt on the ground in front of the altar and started to pound the ground with one fist, causing Zoe to feel a small earthquake as he called out, "Hey Uncle H. Do I have your attention?" Zoe's eyes widened when she realized what was going on. She should have figured out what Naruto was doing sooner, but it had been so long since she had witnessed a major sacrifice that the possibility of seeing one didn't enter into her mind. Naruto lowered his hand before him with his palms pointed to the ground, and he spoke in a somber manner. "For the sins of the Amazon guards and Amazon queen who died today, I offer this to you, Hades." He then used a low-level fire jutsu to ignite the sacrifice. Once the sacrifice was burning properly, Naruto called out, "You can come out now, Zoe. There's no reason for you to hide in the shadows." The hunter walked over from her observation spot towards Naruto. She silently observed the burnt offering and felt Lord Hades' gaze on their location. How could his gaze not be on Naruto, and thus her, given what Naruto had just done? People rarely offered the Lord of the Dead sacrifice since they didn't want his attention. If they did offer a sacrifice for a departed friend, it was typically something small like the daily offerings at camp. Zoe turned her head to see Naruto's somber face illuminated by the sacrificial flames. She then asked, "Why?" Naruto quietly replied, "What happened today should not have occurred. There were ways things could have happened today that would have resulted in far less deaths among the Amazons. The seeds of anger and grief were planted in the hearts of all those guards' families, which likely will blossom into hate in the future. The fact that they were doing their duty and a colleague betrayed their trust, resulting in their deaths, makes this result far more likely. I just hope that they are able to find peace in the afterlife." To Zoe's surprise, Naruto started to sing. "Great Judge of the Bardos Gates, take heed. New souls freshly departed from this realm come to you in need. Be they peasant or noble, shadow or student, woman or man, child or parent, they come alone. Great Judge of the Bardos Gates, let them in, and give them a home. Provide proper measure to the vices and virtues of each man. In this hour, Great Judge, you are the only one who can. Great Judge of the Bardos Gates, take care. The seeds of new life that you have been given are precious and rare." Naruto continued to sing until the embers on the altar died out. Zoe was surprised by the haunting and yet beautiful song she heard. It was an old tune from the Land of Fire that was traditionally sung to commemorate and send off a departed soul after the funeral occurred. Most of the song was for the soul of the dead, wishing them peace in their path to and in their next lifetime. However, the song also asked for comfort for those still living in the latter parts of the song. Once the embers had died, Naruto carefully buried them in a nearby pit to prevent any forest fires. He and Zoe then collected some more wood to put on the altar so that Naruto could make his second offering that evening. This time, the sacrifice was to Asclepius to heal the mental scars that Naruto had inflicted on those 6 Amazons he had to interrogate. Chapter 32. The trio got up bright and early the following morning. Breakfast consisted of Pop-Tarts and granola bars with some cold tea to wash it all down. Their tents were quickly packed after breakfast was finished. Naruto and Zoe left on Bucephalus while Issei rode on Skull Splitter. It only took a few minutes for them to get to Gifford Pinchot National Forest from the outskirts of Seattle down Highway 5. When they neared the National Forest, Zoe tugged on Naruto's shirt to get his attention. Naruto turned around slightly to look at Zoe and said, "What is it, Zoe?" Thankfully, Bucephalus and Skull Splitter were traveling at speeds that allowed their riders to talk. Zoe then said, "Mount St. Helens is nearby. Lord Hephaestus has one of his workshops in the volcano, and it serves as the prison for the monster Typhon. I find it suspicious that our second clue takes us so close to that location. Coincidences do not exist." Naruto nodded his head and replied, "I have to agree with you on that point, Zoe. Unfortunately, we won't find out what the connection is until we've launched our attack." Shortly after the duo talked, the trio dismounted and hid Bucephalus and Skull Splitter in a nearby clump of trees. Zoe manipulated the mist to hide the 2 mounts while Issei carved some runes to ward off any possible threats to the duo. Naruto finished the protection of the horse and wolf by adding his own barrier seals of protection. The trio took one last look at their various protections and then walked towards the address they had taken from the Amazons yesterday. Soon after the trio left their mounts, they quickly confirmed that the Amazons' information was accurate as they sensed a powerful concentration of the mist that was set up to keep everyone from noticing the area. Issei stopped and had to shake his head to clear the effects of the mist. Both Zoe and Naruto paused and glanced at their companion to make sure that he was following them. Issei returned to his previous path after shaking his head, so neither of the other two said a thing. The mist was concentrated enough that it could even affect half-bloods to a degree. Zoe could ignore the effects thanks to her experience, while Naruto was simply too powerful for the mist to affect him. Hidden in the mist was a camouflaged half-buried bunker. Zoe was the first to spot the bunker, and she quickly motioned with her hand for her companions to stop. She then silently pointed out the bunker and, more importantly, the 3 surveillance cameras that were on the trees next to the bunker. The trio quickly grouped together and took stock of the camera's movements. Issei was the first to speak, and he quickly said in a whisper, "There is a blind spot in the camera's view for anything that is over 12 feet above them. I think that's our ticket, and since they haven't pruned back any of the trees." Naruto looked at the trees and frowned. "I don't know what it is, but something doesn't feel right. The security here feels very lacking for a hidden location in a forest to me. There's no hidden pruning to prevent anyone from using the trees as a path to the bunker. I also don't see any faint gleams from razor wire meshes or signs that certain branches have been sliced so that they'll break if you step on them." Zoe replied, "Most mystical locations depend on the mist to hide. The security here seems paranoid to me with how heavy the mist is concentrated here, along with the efforts to hide this bunker with camouflage. However, the security cameras are what concern me. Mortals are the only beings that use them to my knowledge." That news was concerning for the trio. How could mortals be involved in their quest? The mortal and mythical realms traditionally stayed firmly apart from each other, even though they were seamlessly woven together. While the mystical had many fronts in the regular world, those fronts as a rule switched over to mystical means when dealing with the mythical. The mixing of the two, as the security cameras hinted, was unsettling to say the least. Naruto kept his worries from showing on his face and said, "Well, I guess the only thing for us to do is to start climbing the trees and then make our way to the bunker." Naruto and Zoe started to walk up the sides of the trees while Issei started to climb the old-fashioned way. Once the trio was up in the tree canopy, they started heading to the bunker again. A frown appeared on Zoe's face as she sensed that something wasn't right. She then pivoted on the tree branch she was on 90 degrees and then saw something fly past her from the corner of her eye. An almost invisible dart slammed into a nearby branch with enough force to break off pieces of bark. Zoe then had to twist around so that she could grab the branch she was on with her hands and swing from it to another tree in order to avoid a second dart. The forest filled with a cruel-sounding chuckle that eerily echoed throughout tree canopy. "Those are some impressive reflexes you have, girl. Would you happen to be one of that frigid cunt's followers our Western contacts talked about? What would your mistress say about you hanging out with men? Oh wait, that's right, Your Western goddess is supposed to have whored herself out to her stepbrother. Both Naruto and Zoe started to see red with the slander their unknown adversary was obviously directing at Artemis. They were able to keep focus thanks to their training and experience, but their tempers were starting to simmer. Naruto jumped out of the way of a nearly invisible dart of his own. The voice then called out, "Oh, and here is the poor pseudo-incestuous half-blood himself. Would you like some drills to help you on the wedding night? I happened to acquire a few from a job sabotaging an oil field a few months back. I can swear that if you use them you won't have to worry about breaking your laughable manhood off when you have to do your duty." Whoever was attacking the trio was apparently ignoring Issei in favor of taunting and constantly attacking the more experienced members of the trio. This would prove to be its undoing as the perverted boy pulled out a pair of smoke bombs and threw them at the source of the voice. Those hours of peeping had taught Issei how to locate people by sound. Otherwise, he wouldn't have survived some of those excursions to look at the local nymphs. His aim was true, and the almost completely invisible being was smoke bombs that covered it in pink powder. Zoe quickly drew her bow and shot the apparently human-looking being in the knee with an arrow. That arrow was followed by another that hit the being in the foot, pinning it in place. A forlorn howl of pain erupted from the being. This being looked like a human teenager, but his body's outlines flickered at the edges also like tongues of fire. Naruto summoned several clones and had them surround the being with their kanabos drawn. The pink coloring from Issei's attacks soon evaporated from the being. However, he was apparently in too much pain to stay almost completely invisible. Naruto quickly spoke out, demanding, "Who are you and just what is Heptad doing in this area?" The eyes of the trio's prisoner bulged out in shock and blurted out, "How by Lilith's tits do you know about Heptad? There's no way that a scrawny boy toy like you could find out about us." In all honesty, the boy toy comment was very lame in Naruto's opinion. It was in the same ballpark as Sai's dickless comments. Naruto's anger at those comments had cooled before pain invaded Konoha. His issues, outside of a little acting that was part of his genuine friendship with Sai, was simply the fact that it was creepy to constantly have another guy talk about his junk. Naruto directed some killing intent at the prisoner and said, "What are you and why are you helping Heptad? If you tell us what you know and the information is satisfactory, you will be allowed to live." The prisoner had a wild smirk on his face and spat in the face of one of Naruto's clones. "No dice, mongrel. I might only be a Jan, the weakest of the Dijin, but I have my honor." With that said, the proclaimed Jan bit hard on his back tooth, causing an audible crack. Massive quantities of black smoke erupted from the Jan's body as the body dissolved into the smoke. Zoe's eyes widened in surprise when she saw the tree branches in the smoke start to dissolve. She called out, "Everyone back away." The trio quickly fled from the acidic smoke. Naruto quickly grabbed Issei since his friend was the slowest of the questers by far when it came to moving through the trees. Thankfully, the wind was in their favor, blowing the smoke in the opposite direction from where they were headed. Once the trio was safe from the acidic smoke, Naruto turned around to look at the destruction. It looked like someone had come from the sky with a massive shovel and scooped a section of the tree line away. Naruto then muttered, "So much for trying to sneak in undetected." Issei looked at the utter mess inside the bunker and muttered, "Who relieved themselves in the Norn's mead? Just how are we supposed to find our second clue in all of this mess?" Half an hour after the trio's encounter with the Jan, they felt it was safe enough to approach the bunker again. This time they came in fast and hard, expecting to have a massive fight on their hands. Instead, they entered a completely trashed bunker with over a dozen corpses. Zoe looked at the bodies, considered their positions, and frowned. This is a mass killing. Someone killed all of these people and must have fled the bunker using the acidic smoke as cover. A puzzled look appeared on Naruto's face. He was having some trouble getting a solid reading of the situation since the men in the bunker were all shot. Firearms were unknown in the elemental countries unless one considered certain kunai and saban launchers to be primitive guns. His experience on Earth with firearms was purely academic investigation on how they might be beneficial to Konoha. "How can you tell, Zoe? Couldn't these men have just killed each other with makeshift pistols? I thought I read that modern bullets have everything needed to fire a bullet built in them." Zoe shook her head as she remembered her training on firearms. The hunters preferred to use the traditional bow and arrow in their hunts. However, they all had extensive training with firearms since hunting rifles and many other types of guns used in hunting these days fell under Artemis's domain. She quickly started to teach her companions. A modern cartridge bullet can be fired if its primer is struck with sufficient force. Such a thing is extremely dangerous for the shooter if it is not in a gun. However, such a shot is extremely inaccurate as there is no spin imparted by a barrel, or even a steady gripe to hold the cartridge in place as the bullet inside is fired. That's not considering the fact the explosive force used to propel the bullet can destroy a makeshift gun if it is not built to handle said force. She then pointed to the various men's hands and said, "As you can see, their hands don't have splinters from a cheap and easy to conceal makeshift gun being destroyed. Since there aren't any guns near them, that implies that some took the weapon used to kill them. Second, all of the bullet wounds are in the same location. This suggests that one person did the shooting, since if these shots were on a target it would be an extremely close grouping. Multiple people can do that, but it's unlikely given the clustering and the fact that these shoots all have the same general angle." Naruto nodded his head in acceptance. Zoe's words made sense to him, as it wasn't unheard of for an inside man among bandits to kill the rest of his companions and hoping to make a getaway. It also wasn't unheard of for bandits, or even lesser trained soldiers, to turn on each other thinking that someone had betrayed them. That's why one needed to be able to read the situation correctly. Thankfully, Zoe was able to examine the wounds and determine which option was the more likely. Issei spotted an open book and walked over to look at it, while Naruto and Zoe tried to reconstruct as much of the events in the bunker as they could. Confusion crossed the pervert's face for a moment when he got a good look at the book, and then his eyes widened. "Hey everyone, take a look at this. These books are written in a foreign language and alphabet. I could be wrong, but I think that this is Arabic." Zoe quickly walked over and looked at the open page in the book Issei had found. She nodded her head and said, "This is definitely Arabic. I recognize it from when the heart of the West was in Constantinople. The hunt ran into a fair number of Arabic traders over the years when we had to go into the city. It was also helpful when the hunt helped to expel the Arabs from Sicily. The hunt had been a silent partner with the Normans in conquering Sicily, helping to free many women from slavery. A few had joined the hunt, while many had been ferried to convents spread across Europe. They had managed to get away with it only because the Roman and Greek halves of the pantheon were quarreling, pulling most of the Olympians' attention in that area. Naruto quickly asked, "Can you translate what they wrote, Zoe?" A frown appeared on Zoe's face as she thought it over. "I probably can translate what's here, Naruto. However, it's going to take some time. How much time it will take is something I can't say. I literally haven't read or spoken Arabic in centuries. I'll also have to deal with the changes in the language since that time and figure out what variety of Arabic I'm dealing with. Take all the time you need, Zoe. Issei and I can use the time that you're translating their stuff to bury them." Naruto then reached down and gently picked up one of the bodies. He didn't know whose body he was holding, and a gut feeling was telling the half-blood that he probably wouldn't like the person if he had met them while they were living. However, regardless of his feelings on that matter, they were still a fellow human being and deserved to have their remains properly disposed. Back in the elemental lands, even enemy villages would give the corpses of their enemies a proper burial after an examination to learn what they could about the other village. There weren't many visitors to Hephaestus's forges. Lesser members of the mystical world, such as half-bloods and nymphs who weren't connected with Olympus, typically didn't visit the gods unless summoned. Age-old wisdom had taught them that it was best to avoid gods unless one knew that the god or goddess in question was friendly to one. Even then, it was best to not pester the gods so that their friendship did not evaporate. As to the gods and goddesses themselves, most of them tended to avoid the ugly smith. Subconsciously, they were disturbed that a fellow deity could be deformed, as it offended their vanity and self-interest. A few deities didn't visit Hephaestus because the god or goddess in question focused on taking care of their domain, which had little to do with Hephaestus's domain. Over the centuries, Hephaestus had gotten used to being alone as he went about his tasks. He actually enjoyed the chance to test in ingenuity without all of the dramas and shenanigans that tended to happen to other deities. What he didn't enjoy was the fact that he was almost always taken for granted by most of his family. Most of the deities, even the very minor ones, would just send their broken things to his workshop to have them repaired without a thought. They simply expected that their valuable belongings would come back in brand new condition very quickly. There were a few gods and goddesses who were willing to give Hephaestus some thanks for his efforts when they saw him. Sometimes, they'd even come in person to ask him to repair something. Hestia was the first on that list for the god of craftsmen, and her rare orders always got first priority. Hermes also got favorable service from Hephaestus since his brother understood what it was like to be unappreciated for doing your duties. On the other hand, deities that had offended Hephaestus or treated him poorly, like Ares, got the worst service that the god could get away with. Not that it particularly mattered with his asshole older brother, since the meathead always wrecked his stuff far too often. Their father wasn't the only god who hated Ares the most out of all gods. Just as Hephaestus was finishing up one project, he sensed someone enter his workshop. If he had been working on something, then Hephaestus would never have noticed his visitor. The intrusion caused the god to frown thoughtfully. Who could have entered his domain, and what did they want from him? He became even more surprised when his senses told him the visitor was a half-breed. Hephaestus turned his head to the doors of his workshop just as they started to open. Naruto walked through the door with a curious look on his face that turned into a big smile when he spotted the god of craftsmen. A puzzled look appeared on Hephaestus's face when he saw Naruto's smile. People did not normally smile when they saw him, especially when he was in his workshop. In the workshop the god could truly be himself, which meant that he didn't use any of the glamours he used while on Olympus to tone down his ugly features. Naruto called up in a cheerful voice, "Hey there, brother! How are things going for you today?" There was a blink of surprise from the god before he stared down at his half-brother in confusion. Had Naruto really just asked him how things were going? Where was the customary groveling and promises of offerings that half-bloods seemed to offer whenever they were around him when he wasn't at the winter solstice meeting? Not that Hephaestus liked those sorts of things. He could honestly care less about someone offering him a gorgon's head or a minotaur's horn. Sure, he could exchange those trophies for favor points, but he already made a steady amount of favor from auto-deducting his work from the other deities' accounts. As for claiming that they were unworthy to be in his presence, or some other platitude, it pissed him off since he couldn't stand someone trying to butter him up unlike his father. However, being treated like a friendly acquaintance by his mother's unexpected half-blood son was one of the last things that the god was expecting. He blinked again and then replied in a slightly confused voice. "I'm doing well, I suppose. Why are you here, Naruto?" Naruto looked up at his half-brother and replied, "I just came to see how you're doing, brother. My quest brought me near your workshop, and since I currently have some downtime I figured I might as well see if you were around since I haven't met you yet, brother." The god gave his younger sibling a questioning gaze. He didn't bother trying to read Naruto's mind since everyone on Olympus knew that the boy was somehow immune to divine attempts to probe his mind. As Hera's only half-blood child and as Artemis's fiancé, the boy constantly became the center of the Olympus grapevine whenever any new fact about him turned up. Hephaestus knew all about it because he was unfortunately married to the head gossip of Olympus. Silence reigned in the workshop as Hephaestus tried to read Naruto's body for any signs that he was after something. The god's excellent eye for detail when it came to his craftwork was also good at reading people's expressions when he put his mind to do so. That wasn't very often, but this was a special occasion. As Hephaestus expected from what he had heard, but still found hard to believe, was that Naruto was telling the complete truth. Hephaestus then shrugged his shoulders and said, "Well, it's good to meet you, Naruto. There's really not much for half-bloods to see here, and I have several orders that I need to get taken care of now. Is there anything on your mind? I need to get back to work soon." Naruto nodded his head, but the usual confident and determined look was gone. There was a great deal of determination on his face, but also some nervousness masked beneath it. He looked up at his divine half-brother and asked, "Is there anything I can help you with here in the forge, brother? Zoe told me that it will take a few hours at least to get things translated. If you're willing, it would be nice to spend some time with my brother." For the life of him, Hephaestus wondered where his mother had scrounged the celestial bronze needed for Naruto when he was born. She must have a hidden supply of celestial bronze somewhere because he knew the amount of the divine metal in storage to the gram over the past 600 years. Half-bloods don't ask if they can hang out with gods. It was just an unwritten rule that everyone knew and understood. There were occasionally half-bloods who foolishly sought to have a place on Olympus because they thought their deeds made them equal to the gods. Hephaestus frowned and examined Naruto even more carefully. He found no sign that Naruto's request was fueled by pride or a sense of self-importance. He did recognize the look in Naruto's eyes, but he couldn't remember seeing that look on anyone that lived on Olympus. A second later the god remembered that he had seen the look in Naruto's eye among the mortals he occasionally observed while courting his mortal companions. It was the look that a younger siblings gave to their older siblings when they wanted to spend time with them. It was a surprising thought for the god. Hephaestus was willing to admit that he was not an admired god. He was respected for what he could make, but he was not someone that people liked to spend time with. He had a face that not even his mother could love. However, The god found himself not thinking badly about his mother as much anymore since she had become friendlier with him over the past couple of centuries. That friendliness had practically exploded over the past decade, or so, which he suspected had something to do with Hera's time as a human. A sudden realization hit the god. He liked the idea that Naruto wanted to spend time with him because he was the half-blood's brother. Naruto wasn't trying to get in his good graces. He just wanted to be with his brother because of who he was and not what he was. A small smile appeared on Hephaestus's face and he said, "Sure, Naruto. You can start by getting 20 ingots of celestial bronze from that stock over there for me." That night the 3 quest members had gathered around their camp for dinner that Issei had gotten from a nearby restaurant. Issei was sporting a visible handprint on his cheek from annoying a waitress way more than advisable. Skullsplitter was sitting at Issei's feet enjoying the remains of his T-bone steak snack. Bucephalus was laying a little ways away from the trio and happily munching on a bag of apples that Naruto had unsealed for him. Zoe finished her meal and then put the plastic tray in a bag so that she could put it in a trash can later. She then looked at her companions and waited for them to finish their meals. The hunter had to fight off the urge to shake her head in disbelief at what Naruto had done. She really shouldn't be surprised that Naruto had gone off to visit Hephaestus just so he could spend time with his brother. Yes, it wasn't something that normal half-bloods did or even thought about doing. However, this was Naruto that she was considering, and he left normality back in his original world if he never knew it. Once Naruto was finished eating his meal, he turned to look at Zoe and asked, "Were you able to translate those books, Zoe?" Issei stopped eating to turn and look at Zoe as well. Both boys had left the hunter alone for most of the day so that she could translate the books. They had stopped by from time to time to check on her, but mostly she was left alone as everyone did their own thing. Zoe nodded her head and replied, "I have translated the books." It was a little tricky since there were actually 2 different varieties of Arabic. Most of the books were from mortals who were from a few villages in Syria. Those books were mostly useless for our purposes. The mortals all thought that they were part of a terrorist cell preparing to deliver a nuclear bomb somewhere in downtown Los Angeles. They also thought that they were here to prepare the bomb's delivery system with a secondary plan of trying to detonate MT St. Helens if they were found out. Naruto's eyes widened and he quickly cut in. The so-called nuclear bomb that the mortals were preparing for must actually be the Yada no Kagami. I'm also willing to bet that Heptad, who is leading this group, is really trying to target Hephaestus since he has MT St. Helens as one of his preferred forges. Zoe nodded her head. That is where the second and older variety of Arabic is from in the books I read today. There weren't many, so I think that Heptad was trying to keep their plans as verbal as possible. However, they did have to put some things into writing, and their writings were in an older variety that I was more familiar with. As you guessed, Naruto, the group's main plan at this stage was to try and use the Yada no Kagami on Lord Hephaestus to test its effects on the Olympians. Once the test is complete, they were planning on going to Los Angeles and use it on the hospitable one. The mortals were building a device that was supposed to amplify the mirror's effects and make it easier to use. Issei had a worried look on his face as he spoke up. "How much does this device amplify the mirror, and where is it? I don't recall seeing any major device in the bunker that could be mistaken as a nuclear, not that I really know what such a device would look like." Zoe smiled and said, "Taichi was kind to us in this matter. There were several faults in their initial design, forcing them to break apart the entire setup a few days and wait for new parts before we came here." Naruto nodded his head and commented, "That's good news for us. However, I am still confused at something. Why did Heptad kill all of the mortals in the bunker, and who was also in the bunker? He couldn't figure out why someone would kill a comrade, since that was one less person to help you achieve your goal. Not that he was particularly sorry that the mortals were dead given what they had hoped to do. So he simply stated, the mortals were dead men walking. Heptad was going to execute them once they had served their purpose. My guess is that whoever the other person in the bunker was decided to get rid of them when the base was discovered and their sentry exploded. Do either of you know what that sentry could have been? I have never seen something like that anywhere in the West." The resident ninja quickly shook his head, but Issei had a thoughtful look on his face. Both of his companions turned to look at the group's pervert. After a minute, Issei said, "I think I have heard about Digins before. If I remember correctly, they're a group of beings that live on outskirts of the South Realm. My grandmother once mentioned a group of beings made of fire who lived in the South who could eventually regenerate from a spark of themselves. She could have been talking about Digin, but I'm honestly not sure." Silence ruled for a few minutes until Zoe spoke up. I suppose that will be something else we'll have to learn about later. The good news is that I was able to get the location of the base where Heptad is currently keeping the mirror. Naruto nodded his head and said, "That's good, Zoe. Given the lead time our enemy has had to escape, I think we can safely assume that our unknown member of Heptad has alerted his compatriots in their second base. Let's get some rest and then move out tomorrow to try and find clues about their next move in their base." The other two members of the quest glanced at each other, and then nodded their heads in agreement. Any enemy with 2 brain cells would have abandoned the second base since it was mentioned in recoverable intel in the lost base. The trio then cleaned up the campsite from their dinner. Chapter 33. Naruto was having a restless night as a vision of the past plagued his dream. His dream self was floating above the ancient city of Rome, while a massive army was camped out in a siege around the city. Naruto frowned as he sensed a miasma of darkness emanating from Rome. This miasma was not the stench that came from a city with poor sanitation. This was a foulness that eats at you by merely being in its presence. Naruto had experienced it in the past, such as when he was around Orochimaru, when he encountered certain members of Akatsuki like Tobi or the zombie twins, or when he had dreams of the Abyss War. The miasma emanating from the city was trying to infect the camp of Goths surrounding the city. However, various runes carved on the banner poles spread around the camp prevented the miasma from spreading. Naruto's viewpoint was then pulled towards the camp. For the most part, the camp looked very normal for a Germanic camp of the time campaigning. Blacksmiths were forging new weapons and armor for the army. Many soldiers were sitting around feasting on wine and food seized from the nearby estates. Naruto's temper spiked as he watched a few of the soldiers here and there raping some young women who had likely been kidnapped from the estates that had provided the food. He knew that such things were regrettably part of the times back when this dream vision was taking place. However, that didn't stop the half-blood shinobi from hating the practice on moral grounds and also opposing it on practical grounds as well. Even if one factored out the massive moral issues with rape, there was also the fact that it was a massive potential vector for disease to spread among an army. Just when Naruto was about to start complaining about what he was seeing, the dream's focus shifted a bit to a nearby Goth lord who was looking on at the same scene as Naruto with disgust in his eyes. The lord walked over to the warriors who were using one of the women for entertainment, and lopped off one of their heads. All of the nearby Goths took immediate notice, and several pulled out their weapons. One of the warriors tried to avenge his friend and was quickly cut down. He then grabbed the poor battered woman and then covered her with his cloak. Naruto was silently cheering the noble on as he summoned several guards to capture all of the soldiers who were using the local women. Once the rapists were dealt with, the noble walked towards the center of the camp and Naruto's dream self was pulled along as well. The noble came to a large tent near the center of the camp and quickly entered it. There were over a dozen nobles with their king who were looking at a map of Rome that was laid out of the table in the middle of the gathering. Naruto saw the noble he had been following walk up to the king and nod his head. He then said, "It has been done, Lord Alaric." King Alaric nodded his head and said, "Good. Send the captured women out of the camp with a small group of guards who you can trust. The guards will take the women to the convent here." Alaric paused to point a map of Italy that was lying next to the map of Rome. The noble in question eyes widened slightly, seeing that the convent Alaric was pointing to was almost 2 weeks away. Alaric saw the surprise in the noble's eyes and said, "A portion of the loot from Rome will be set aside for the guards. The women must make it to this convent since its isolation will enable them to heal from the torments our former warriors inflicted on them." A few of the nobles looked upset over Alaric's actions. Alaric noticed their discontent and firmly said, "My orders stand. When we take Rome tomorrow, the men may take all of the material goods from the city that they wish. However, the citizens of the city are to be left alone. Despite what the Roman emperor and his advisors think, we are not savage animals. The wealth of Rome itself will be recompense for our thankless years of fighting and dying for an empire that sees us as worth less than a dog. Remember, we would not be here if the Romans had honored their promises to us." Silence filled the tent for a few seconds. Alaric then looked at nobles in his tent and said, "Now, why don't we all break for the night? It is getting late and the battle tomorrow will be hard work." The nobles around the table nodded their heads and slowly left the tent talking with each other. Once everyone had left, Alaric walked over to his chair and slumped down in exhaustion. He then rested his head on a hand and sighed. "Mother, uncle, forefathers, why have I been forced to handle this task? All I want is a place where my people can call home. Why couldn't those pompous, backstabbing, honorless swine who called themselves the emperor's advisors have just given his men what they promised? Pannonia was practically empty of Romans, and while maybe not the absolute best land in the empire, it is very good land for my people. Alaric's eyes then drifted over to a box that was heavily cloaked by the weave. It was so heavily cloaked that even onces like him needed a special blessing in order to see the box. Alaric sighed again and muttered to himself. Tomorrow is going to be a very bloody and ugly day. Naruto was suddenly pulled from his dream vision by one of his movement alarm seals going off and waking him via a chakra thread. The young ninja instantly bolted away and had his hand on a kunai as he started to look around for the source of movement. He relaxed when Zoe was revealed to be up and walking about. Zoe whirled around and saw Naruto wake up. She saw him relaxed after spotting her, and then he pulled his hand away from the kunai he was a second away from unclipping. A faint blush of embarrassment appeared on her cheeks, which was thankfully covered by the low visibility of the camp at night. Zoe knew that Naruto had ways of detecting movement that she wasn't used to dealing with. However, her pride was still trying to accept that as easily as her mind had. It was a point of pride for Zoe that she could be extremely stealthy when she wished to be. The shinobi half-blood got up so that he was sitting Indian style on the floor. Naruto looked at Zoe and asked, "Well, since I'm up, what is bothering you, Zoe?" After thinking about it for a moment, Zoe sat down in front of Naruto. She then said in a tired voice, "I don't like how everything keeps changing. For millennia things have remained virtually unchanged. Technology has improved, but it was at a generally slow, easily assimilated rate. The heart of the West moved from time to time. However, everyone mostly acted as they always did, so the location never became too important." She paused for a moment to look up at the moon, hoping to draw strength from her mistress's chariot. Zoe wasn't comfortable talking about all of this with Naruto, but she needed to get this off of her chest, and she knew that she could trust Naruto to keep his mouth shut. For someone who could be quite boisterous at times, he could be very tight-lipped when it came to things that he needed to keep secret for other people. "I have seen more changes and surprises these last 2 decades than I have in any 2 centuries that I have been with the hunt. Plus, I know that there are several major changes coming up soon in the future. Who knows what else has been woven that will surprise us?" A small chuckle escaped Naruto's lips as a thoughtful look appeared on his face. "I sort of know what you mean, Zoe. While I may not have the experience of living an extremely long life, I do have plenty of experience with major changes in my life. Some major changes were good, some were horrifying, several were depressing, and a few knocked me off of my feet. All I can say is that the only way to deal with the changes is to accept them one day at a time." Zoe frowned slightly and replied, "I suppose that is true. However, let's just say that when you're used to thinking in terms of seasons and decades for planning purposes, it is very difficult to speed up your perceptions of time. It's one thing if you're reacting in a fight or in a hunt, since those are mostly instinctual. But when it's something that requires a lot of thought, it is very difficult." Naruto shrugged his shoulders and said, "I'll take your word for it, Zoe. However, I would like to remind you that your family and friends will be there for you to help you through this. You've got quite a lot considering your friends at camp, your sisters, your mother, and your potential father." "What do you mean by my sisters, my mother, or my potential father, Naruto? My sisters consider me dead to them and wiped from history. My mother sadly faded centuries ago. As for my sire, I refuse to speak of him." The comment about her sisters confused Naruto of a moment until he realized that Zoe was referring to her biological family. To answer the hunter's question, he simply pulled out a scroll, unsealed some papers from it, and handed a subsection of the papers to Zoe. Even with the poor night light, she was able to read the document. Her eyes widened in surprise and she turned to look at Naruto, almost gaping like a fish. The hunter said in a shocked voice, "Adoption papers?" Gently taking the papers back, Naruto nodded his head and answered her question. "I know that Artemis views all of the hunters as her daughters rather than merely being handmaidens. That's why she's in the situation she currently is in, thanks to my birth. My thought was that if I cannot free her from the bargain, the least I could do is make the Hunt family in law as well as in fact." Disbelief filled Zoe's face as she tried to form a coherent thought in her mind. It was an open secret in the Hunt that all of the hunters viewed Artemis as a beloved older sister and as a mother figure. The fact that Artemis returned those feelings was one of the major reasons why the hunters had been willing to tolerate Naruto courting their goddess. If their mistress was merely doing it out of a sense of obligation, then there would have been a mass suicide of hunters a couple of years ago. However, the thought that they might actually become Artemis's daughters, even if it was just by adoption, was something that all of the hunters thought could never come true. Misreading Zoe's disbelief, Naruto quickly spoke. Honest, these adoption papers are 100% legitimate back in Konoha. All it needs is each hunter's signature on their adoption papers, the Uzumaki clan seal which Artemis has, and the Hokage's signature to have the adoption take effect. Back when I was much younger, one of my fondest wishes was for someone to adopt me, so I memorized the forms hoping for the day someone would use them for me. That bit of information managed to reset Zoe's mental switch back to the on position. She did not like what she knew of Naruto's childhood in the least. Child abuse was something that disgusted her no matter the gender of the child, and what happened to Naruto was too close to abuse or minor levels of abuse in various areas to sit well with her. Zoe was just thankful that Naruto had emerged from his first childhood in much better condition than most people would. She then gave a small smile and said, "I have no doubt that the forms are correct, Naruto. If Lady Artemis agrees, I and the rest of the hunters will most likely accept your offer of adoption. Now, I think it is time I try to get more rest." With that said, Zoe returned to her sleeping bag and got back in it. The next morning, the questing trio quickly had breakfast and made a break for Las Vegas, which was where Zoe had found out the other Heptad base was located. Thankfully, they were able to make it into the city before the desert sun could become a problem. The trio did not immediately head to the address given for the Heptad base. Only a complete idiot wouldn't expect Heptad to be on alert for them, and the mirror had undoubtedly been moved. Maybe if they had been able to find and reach the base before the mysterious member who fled from the base near Mount St. Helens, it would have been a different story. It was an unlikely possibility since Heptad appeared to be comfortable mixing in mortal means in addition to the mythical. Bucephalus and Skullsplitter were extremely fast, but they weren't faster than a phone call. Issei had wondered if Heptad might still have the Yada no Kagami at their Las Vegas base. After all, wouldn't Heptad consider it better to keep the mirror in a defensible location rather than move it? Also, what reason did Heptad have to consider that the trio could even find the Las Vegas base in the first place? Both Zoe and Naruto had to explain to their companion that what he was suggesting was utter stupidity for an organization that was trying to hide. Naruto knew this from his ninja training and specialized training from Jiraiya in being a spy master. Zoe had learned all of this the hard way hunting down criminals who Artemis decided needed to be removed for their crimes against women. Hoping your enemy had caught the idiot ball, especially for one as competently ruthless as Heptad was showing itself to be, qualified one for a Darwin Award. The trio stopped at the closest park to City Hall and dismounted. Zoe quickly led Bucephalus and Skullsplitter to an area of the park that had fresh water and started to hide them with the mist. Issei turned to Naruto and asked, "Okay, Naruto. Why are we heading to City Hall? I'm just not seeing how it helps on our quest." Naruto gave his friend a smile and said, "We're going after information. Our primary target has undoubtedly been moved, but there is probably a lot of useful information for us at the base that Heptad wasn't able to move before they left. Just knocking down the front door without any information on the facility is very stupid if there are ways to get said information in a timely manner. The base is in the city, which means that its basic floor plans and the floor plans of any nearby buildings are registered at City Hall. With those plans we can anticipate most potential trap locations or areas where any possible remaining Heptad forces could likely attack us from." An uneasy look crossed Issei's face when he was told that. Naruto's stated reasoning for going to City Hall made some sense to biggest mortal pervert of the century. Issei would be the first to admit that his skills at espionage did not go beyond how to sneak a glimpse inside the girls' locker room. However, something didn't sit right with him. Just how much can we trust the plans in the city records? I mean, couldn't Heptad have completely changed the interior of the building? This caused the shinobi to shake his head. That is very unlikely, Issei. If Heptad had used mystical means to rebuild the interior of their base, then they would have been noticed. I'm not an expert on it by any stretch of the imagination, but from what I've been told, the magic involved in something like that is very attention-grabbing. Naruto paused for a second to give Zoe a questioning look for confirmation. Once the hunter nodded her head, he continued. Since Heptad is trying to stay under the radar for the mystical, that excludes mystical means of construction. Naruto paused for a second so that he could remember all of the differences between the United States and the Land of Fire when it came to buildings and record-keeping. Once he had made sure his facts were straight, he continued his explanation. Mortal means of renovations require a lot of permits and permissions that will be on file in the records. These can't be faked or hidden by the mist, since you'll have the receipts and delivery records by the companies who do the work. Those same companies typically need to confirm that all of the permits are on record before they do any work. Most of the time Naruto found the amount of red tape that existed in America to be bewildering. For all that the noble courts back home were supposed to be about an organized and accurate accounting, what Naruto had seen in America made them look like complete slobs. However, in this situation that red tape was a blessing from heaven. It was so much simpler to try and find out about a building and its layout when it was all written down in a public location. A slightly guarded public location and out of normal public access, but that wasn't a problem for Naruto. The trio then spent the next 15 minutes hashing out what their cover story was and getting all of the details straight. They were going to use the mist to get themselves access. However, the mist always worked best when used by a group if everyone was creating the same illusion. It was trickier than having just one person manipulate the mist. The payoff came with the fact that multiple minor manipulation were less intensive on the manipulators than a massive manipulation. Also, the minor illusions reinforced themselves to become even more powerful than anything a half-blood could do on their own. Once the trio was ready, they left the park and walked towards City Hall. Before they had walked a block, Naruto had to grab onto Issei's shoulder twice and give a strong squeeze to keep the overly hormonal boy from chasing after some scantily clad women. At the same time, Zoe was fighting the urge to smack Issei on the back of the head. She was half seriously pondering whether or not gelding Issei would cause his perversion to lower to the typical level of a normal male. The only good thing that Zoe could say about Issei on that matter was that for all of his perversion, he would only move past looking if he had a willing partner. She never wanted to see Issei again once this quest was complete, but she wasn't about to put his name up for nomination as someone her mistress should kill as an enemy maidens. Suggesting he spend a few weeks or months as a jackalope was still in the cards though. The trio entered City Hall and headed to one of the receptionist's desks. Zoe started the first bit of mist manipulation just before she greeted the receptionist. "Good morning, ma'am." There was a second delay as the seasoned receptionist paused what she was doing to look at the trio standing in front of her. She gave them a smile and said, "Good morning, children. It's not often we people as young as you here. What can I help you with today?" Zoe kept a respectful look on her face, ignoring the children remark, and continued to speak for the trio. "We're here for the school project from the John D. Rockefeller Memorial Academy for Future Business and Science Leaders. We arranged almost 2 months ago for access to the city's archives for urban plans as part of our school's summer project. Can we please have the passes to the archives?" As planned, the mist caused the receptionist to become friendlier than usual. It didn't overpower her senses and make her hand over the passes. Zoe was skilled enough in mist manipulation to achieve that. However, the trio felt that such tactics had the potential to cause too many problems for them. The fact that the security guard who was watching everything through the security camera might find it all very odd to see the receptionist just handing out the passes for one. The mist could create very real and believable illusions that fooled regular mortals easily. Computers were a completely different matter, and the trio had no idea what kind of automatic systems might be in the city hall. The receptionist started to check the system and naturally could not find the reservation that Zoe had told her about. A frown appeared on her face and she said, "I'm sorry, dear, but the system is not showing a mention about teenagers being granted access to the archives for a school project." Naruto turned to face Issei and said, "Are you sure that this is the correct date and time, Issei? You were tasked with arranging the passes for us on this project. If we have to go back through the school to arrange things, Mr. Burner is going to penalize us 5% from the final grade for failing to meet the project goals that were set for the pre-summer vacation milestone." A minor twist of the mist increased the receptionist's sympathy for the trio. Issei nodded his head and quickly answered according to plan. "I did, Naruto. Mr. Burner was there when I made the call and arranged for our passes today. He told me that I documented everything better than he expected. If I had my project logbook on me, I could show you everything. The only thing I can think of is that the person I talked to had sounded pretty tired and hurried, like they were handling several tasks at once. Maybe my call got misfiled or wasn't entered into the system because the person I talked to got pulled away for another task." The subtitle manipulations of the trio merged in the receptionist's mind and shaped themselves to fit with her memories. She frowned and sighed. "You must have called back when the bug was making its way through the office. Several of us were out at the time and Becky was still in training. Things were pretty hectic then, so I'm sorry to say your passes were probably misplaced." Naruto nodded his head and then said, "I guess these things happen. Looks like we'll have to write all of this down and inform Mr. Burner. Hopefully, he'll be willing to grant us a special dispensation from the penalty since this was completely out of our control." Can we set up our new pastime right now? A small smile appeared on the receptionist's face as she started to type on her computer. In a sweet voice she said, I can do one better, you three. If you'll just wait a few minutes, I can authorize you three to have access to the archives like you were promised. Zoe's eyes widened slightly as needed for the act and cheerfully said, Really, Ms.? Oh, thank you for doing this for us. This won't cause you any trouble, will it? This final manipulation locked everything in place by reinforcing the prior alterations made with the mist. The receptionist shook her head. It's not a trouble at all, Mississippi. This whole mess was our fault, and I am merely correcting a mistake on the office's part. She then asked for the trio's name to complete the paperwork. After she finished typing everything up, the receptionist printed out 3 temporary passes and handed them to the trio. It took the trio almost 3 hours to find all of the relevant documents and make copies of them. Issei turned out to be hopeless when it came to finding regular information. On the flip side, he was practically a bloodhound when it came to sniffing out anything provocative or risque. The record room was apparently City Hall's designated place to hide anything that was not safe for work, even when one worked in Las Vegas. The amount of porn and other questionable items Issei found had left the pervert happy, Naruto in disbelief, and Zoe contemplating arson. Besides Issei's hunt for hentai loot, Naruto's and Zoe's own efforts to find the plans were plagued by their own issues. Zoe was not used to book research. It just wasn't a skill that she needed to develop as a hunter. Artemis's followers spent most of their time in the woods, and it wasn't like they were doing term papers to pass the time. For his part, Naruto was simply drowning in too much information. He was used to looking much harder for much less information and then trying to puzzle out the facts from what he could find. The occasional reports he had to do in school had helped a bit, but unfamiliarity with many of the American legal document types negated that edge. The trio was currently in a local sub shop having lunch and waiting out the heat. Naruto had sent a clone out to make sure their steeds had fresh water. A portable altar was set up between Naruto and Zoe. They used the mist to make the altar seem to be a regular candle like the shop normally kept on their tables. Issei just shook his head slightly when he saw Naruto and Zoe make their sacrifices. It just didn't make any sense in Issei's mind why anyone would just waste good food. If the nonce wanted to make a minor sacrifice to a god, they'd simply hunt something and hang the kill by the neck from an old tree, preferably an oak or a yew tree if one could be found. Norns knew that Issei had made plenty of sacrifices to his mother's superiors when he got in trouble in the hopes of getting a light sentence. Once the trio finished eating, they put their plates to the side and pulled out a copy of the blueprints for Heptad's base. It was a warehouse on the outer edges of the city. The front Heptad was using for the location was that they were operating an internet casino along with in-house shipping of various prizes across the country. Naruto figured that the facility had to be a communications hub of some sort for Heptad given the various permits and construction liens placed on the warehouse for fiber optic installation along with other more traditional communication connections. Part of Naruto really wished he knew more details about modern mortal communication methods. If he knew that, it would be a Tartarus of a lot easier for him to figure out just how important the base was for Heptad's communications. For all he knew, this could be a small local hub, a regional hub, or the heart of communications for North America to Heptad. Naruto sat back in his chair and shook his head. Assaulting bases with such unknowns was asking for trouble. He couldn't ask Taichi for help since she apparently had it out for him for some reason. Benzaden might be in his corner, but Naruto didn't want to push the goddess of the elemental nations when it came to counteracting Taichi. The level of importance of the facility to Heptad's communications would have a major effect on the organization's actions. A relatively unimportant facility could be written off and abandoned completely. If the facility was critical, then there likely would be stiff resistance even though the mirror was undoubtedly gone. Another thing that concerned Naruto was the interior layout of the facility. Over the past decade and a half that the facility had been owned by Heptad, a troubling fact all on its own, it had undergone a series of renovations. On their own, the renovations were simple and harmless enough. In many cases, they even seemed to be logical outgrowths of prior renovations. When added all together, the renovations to the facility turned it into a nightmare to attack. Anyone assaulting the facility would find themselves forced to loop around and around the building in a spiral with periodic choke points until they reached the center where of the building there was a large room on the blueprints labeled computer cores. A room which apparently had its own air filtration and cooling system. The core room had to be either some kind of a vault or a command center for Heptad. The only way to get to it easily would be to smash through the walls to get to the room, and that wasn't a very bright idea. Heptad had all the walls built reinforced, and there was wiring all over the place. Definitely lent weight to the idea that this facility was of some importance to Heptad. A glance at his companions told Naruto that Zoe and Issei were seeing the same problems that he had. The question was, what they would do about them to progress on the quest. Chapter 34. Early evening found the trio of Naruto, Zoe, and Issei hiding the building across the street from the Heptad base's main entrance. The trio all had binoculars to their faces as they visually scanned the premises for guards or any changes from the blueprints they had acquired earlier in the day. Naruto put down his binoculars and created a shadow clone. Seconds later the clone popped out of existence with almost no smoke to pass along a message to the clones watching the building from other angles. The shinobi closed his eyes and focused on the memories from the various clones as they came to him. Once Naruto had reviewed the memories, he spoke up. There is no advantage to attacking one of the side entrances. All are equally guarded, and these guards are all alert and have radios for quick backup. At least half a dozen other people have been spotted from their shadows in the upper level windows. It looks like this base is important like we feared. Furthermore, it seems that all of the guards are mortal. Zoe frowned as she took off her quiver full of celestial bronze arrows and sealed it away into a seal on her belt. Given Heptad's forces at that other base, we really should have expected that. She then activated another seal on her belt to unseal a quiver full of steel-tipped arrows. The hunter then calmly put the quiver on her back and resumed her observations of the building. As she did that, Issei changed out the rounds in his hunting rifle from cold iron to mortal hollow-point rounds. In many ways, the fates had been very wise when they set the conditions for Naruto's companions. Chiron and Camp Half-Blood were fairly good at training half-bloods in how to survive. That training had only gotten better with the increase in resources and training available to the camp. However, it had one glaring weakness. Campers were not trained to deal with taking human lives. They could handle fighting and killing monsters, but mortals were a totally different kettle of fish. This quest already had a large mortal body count, and it was about to rise. Zoe and Issei did not have those issues since both of them were blooded warriors like Naruto. Issei hadn't killed a mortal before this quest, but his training had prepped him for the shock and after effects of taking a human life. As for Zoe, she grew up in a much more violent time and had sent at least a dozen boatloads of customers to Sharon. That's not to say that the former nymph was a cold-blooded killer. She just had plenty of experience with killing over her long life. Naruto created several shadow clones and had them transformed to look like a gang of teenagers. He then nodded to Issei and Zoe, letting them know that the mission was getting ready to start. Issei and Zoe quickly picked their targets and waited for the signal to start shooting. Naruto was focusing on manipulating the mist to create a barrier around the warehouse that would turn anyone approaching it or heading in the general area away by convincing them they had somewhere else they needed to be. Things were about to get bloody enough without adding bystanders into the mix. The gang of shadow clones started walking towards the guards in a way that made it look like they had just been walking down the street. One of the clones started to jeer at the guards and the others joined in. At first the guards took the insults. However, it was plain to anyone who was looking at them that the guards were barely able to restrain themselves from lashing out. All restraint was lost when one of the clones on a hunch made a particularly insulting remark about a certain religious figure. Just as Naruto suspected, Heptad had recruited religious extremists to be their mortal agents who were under the impression that they were here to wage jihad against the infidels. Zoe and Issei quickly shot the guards furthest away from the clones. The magic in Issei's rifle muzzled its noise level to that of a movie silencer. At the same time, the clones pulled out their kunai and quickly gutted the nearest guards. In less than 5 seconds it was all over and the guards were dead. The trio broke from their hiding spot and quickly ran to the door. Naruto's clones were dragging the dead guards away to hide their bodies. It would make the mortal-repelling mist construct work more efficiently than if it had to hide the bodies. The trio waited next to the door for a few seconds for the clones to check to see if any guards were heading towards them. Naruto stood next to the door and kicked it open as soon as the clones popped to give the all clear. Zoe and Issei rushed into the open doorway and hollered clear. Knowing that every second could be precious, the trio rushed down the hallway to the next door. Naruto created a couple of clones as he was running. Hera's son then took a similar position with the new door as he had with the door to the exit. The door was kicked down, and this time the clones rushed in before Issei and Zoe went in to provide cover fire. Good thing that the clones went in first, as one of them received a 9mm in the gut from a Heptad guard in the new corridor. Issei killed that guard by punching his nose and with his gauntlet-covered fist. Another guard was reaching for his gun, but Zoe shot him before he could respond. In a similar manner, the trio zigzagged their way around the Heptad base. Sometimes they would come across empty rooms, and other times they would encounter resistance. Naruto tried to use his sensor abilities to give Zoe and Issei an edge by creating enough clones to protect them as they entered the room. He left the clones he made behind in the rooms to help protect their rear and to search for anything useful. There was one close call when a guard grazed Issei's shoulder. A clone was able to kill that guard before he fired a second shot. Another clone had helped Issei put on a bandage while moving. Speed was the trio's best ally against Heptad. Their attack was simply too fast for Heptad's forces in the base to organize against. They had built their base in such a way that it would be a nightmare for a SWAT team to go against without extremely heavy losses. Their training and response times were therefore geared for a more cautious enemy. Heptad's plan was rather simple and still effective: lock their enemies in place and allow more of their people to join in the shooting fest. Things got too dire, they could always use the sprinkler system to launch a chemical attack on the enemy. Fortunately for the trio, they were moving way too fast for Heptad's plans. It took time to ready the system so that a chemical attack could be launched. Heptad also only kept a very limited amount on hand at any one time. Keeping extremely toxic chemicals on hand in great quantities when most of your personnel wanted to die in a holy war against a people they viewed as a great evil while hiding in a city synonymous with sin and debauchery was not a good idea. At least, it wasn't a smart idea if one wanted to keep their workers alive and remain undetected. The question of the use of a chemical weapon soon became irrelevant when the trio forced their way into one of the rooms close to the area marked on the plans as the computer core. The room was unimportant to the trio as it only had two guys sitting at desktops typing away. A shadow clone shuriken in the back of each worker's head eliminated the duo in charge of the base's chemical attack system before they could get up from their chairs. Since it was a small room, Naruto merely left a single clone to try and investigate the room as the trio continued on to the next room. Momentum for the trio's blitzkrieg finally slowed when they reached the door to the computer core at the heart of Heptad's facility. Naruto gave the metal door a firm kick just like he had all of the others, only this time the door did not move. He frowned for a second and kicked the door harder, only for a 4-inch deep impression of his foot to appear. Two more powerful and swift kicks created matching impressions in the door. The shinobi turned to face his companions and said, "Back away from the door. This one is seriously reinforced, so whatever is beyond it must be extremely important." Naruto walked about 6 feet back away from the door. He paused for a second to make sure Zoe and Issei were clear of his path, and then started to run to the door. At the last possible second, Naruto preformed a spin kick that connected with the center of the door, sending it flying 5 feet. He quickly rushed through the open door with his kunai drawn, ready to take advantage of any surprise the flying door would have caused. The other two members of the trio hurried into the room hot on Naruto's heels. All three members of the trio stopped in their tracks when they got a good look at what was inside the so-called computer core room. Issei blurted out, "Oh, now that's just bullshit." Standing in front of the trio was something straight out of a cyberpunk nightmare. A new version of the Minotaur stood ready for its first task of combat. This Minotaur was 40% larger in all proportions from the Minotaur that Theseus and every subsequent half-blood had killed. The lower half of this Minotaur's right arm had been removed and a rotary autocannon put in its place. This autocannon was belt-fed from an armored backpack that seemed to have been merged with the monster's back. Armor of some mystical sort that the trio couldn't recognize appeared to have been bolted onto the beast. One of its eyes was replaced with a camera with an additional laser-guided system attached. In the Cybertaur's hand was a wicked-looking double-headed axe that had blades larger than Naruto's head. It quickly became clear why the Cybertaur's eye had been replaced as the monster locked onto the trio and pointed its autocannon at them. All members of the quest were shocked at seeing the modern and the mystical mixed in an unholy manner. Zoe was in the most shock, but even she was able to listen to her instincts that screamed at her to get out of the way. The trio bolted just in time as a steady stream of .50 caliber bullets were shot from the autocannon. Naruto quickly created a dozen clones who started creating barrier seals for protection. Thank Taichi, the autocannon the Cybertaur was packing wasn't shooting bullets at machine gun level speeds. However, there wasn't much to be thankful for, as a .50 caliber bullet fired each second in an enclosed space by an enemy will still ruin someone's day. Once some of the clones were ready, they switched themselves with objects near Zoe and Issei. They then activated the barrier seals to give the trio some time to think. As Cybertor continued to fire its autocannon into Naruto's barrier, the barrier started to waver. Naruto got an idea and started to prep a Rasengan cannon. He nodded to one of his clones that was behind the barrier protecting him, and gave it a look towards the corner. The shadow clone got the message and dashed off behind the corner. The other 3 clones got in front of Naruto ready to act as ablative shields. Cybertor let out a roar of bloodlust as its latest shot broke the barrier. A smirk appeared on Naruto's face as he fired the Rasengan cannon at Cybertor, and then used the Kawarimi Jutsu to change place with the clone that was behind the corner. The Rasengan flew true, and hit the muzzle of the autocannon just as another bullet was coming out of the barrel. An explosion was heard throughout the computer core room, and it was so loud that the trio were forced to cover their ears. Seconds later, the trio were able to uncover their ears and glance at Cybertor. Issei let out a small holler of success when he saw that Naruto's Rasengan had completely destroyed Cybertor's autocannon. Now they had a solid shot at putting this monster down. Cybertor's ear twitched at Issei's yell, and the beast whipped around to face the young-ons. The monster gathered some spit and then spat at Issei. A hissing sound could be heard when Cybertor's spit landed on the ground, revealing that it was an extremely potent acid. Naruto drew his kanabo and charged it with wind chakra, giving the battle club the additional cutting properties of a sword. He tried to take advantage of Cybertor's distraction and score a solid hit. However, those ears on the beast's head were extremely sensitive, and the monster was far faster than his build would suggest. The kanabo was quickly parried by the double-headed axe wielded by the cybernetic beast. A split second later, the parry was followed with a counter-strike that Naruto was able to block. While Naruto kept the attention of Cybertor, Zoe and Issei turned to look at each other so they could think about what to do. Zoe whispered, "Do you have any ranged weapons besides that rifle?" Issei shook his head. Zoe then commanded, "Get your hands on any valuable-looking documents of devices that look like they could be destroyed. I'll help Naruto with my bow." Normally, Zoe would not try to use her bow at this short of a range and instead use her hunting knives. This was not a normal situation, as there wasn't really room for 2 people to maneuver against another opponent effectively in close-quarters combat. Zoe pulled out her bow as quietly as she could and carefully drew an arrow. She was now ready for the hard part, with her arrow notched and bow ready to release. Her eyes narrowed as she tried to predict exactly where Naruto and Cybertor were moving and how they would react to each other and any actions on her part. This was the hardest kind of shot a markswoman could try to make, even if she had the good fortune of being very close to her target. The slightest mistake on her part would cause Cybertor to turn on her and possibly kill her before she could react. Or she could possibly hit Naruto instead of Cybertor. A stroke of luck occurred when Zoe was able to spot Cybertor preparing for a powerful strike. She quickly released an arrow which flew straight and true, burying itself deep in Cybertor's back at an impressive angle between the armor plates of the monster's shoulder blade and its back. A bellow of pain and anguish erupted from the beast. This primal bellow came to an abrupt end when Naruto slammed his kanabo into Cybertor's head, smashing the beast's skull. The beast's body collapsed onto the floor in front of Naruto. Before the trio could say or do anything, something completely unexpected happened. Sparks of black and red electricity started to arc across Cybertor's body. These sparks grew larger and brighter by the second. Soon all of the electricity started to gather around Cybertor's chest into an infinity loop. An aura of dread started to fill the room as the infinity loop shifted in color from red/black into gold. That feeling of dread grew even greater as the golden loop sunk into Cybertor's chest. Once the loop vanished, the monster's body began to slowly disintegrate in the normal manner of Western monster, leaving behind a wrecked autocannon trophy and 3 very confused questers. Later that night, Zoe stood in front of a small pond using her minuscule inherited control of water to create a small geyser so that she could send an Iris message. Zoe tossed a drachma into the spray of water, saying, "Goddess Iris, I asked to speak with my mistress, the Lady Artemis." Artemis appeared on in the mist almost a minute later, looking a bit embarrassed with her hair wet, and the edges of a bathrobe appearing in the headshot of the goddess. Zoe looked down slightly in respect and said, "I'm sorry to call you at an inconvenient time, my lady." The goddess shook her head and quickly said, "It's not an inconvenient time for me to talk to you, Zoe. If something has come up that requires you to talk to me while on your quest, it must be important." Artemis had complete confidence in her lieutenant's abilities and experience. She was a little annoyed to have her bath interrupted. However, the goddess figured that her old friend's concerns were more important than a little creature comfort. Zoe quickly related to Artemis everything that had happened regarding Cybertor and gave the goddess a little background on Heptad as part of the explanation. A frown appeared on Artemis's face, and she closed her eyes trying to recall everything she knew about monsters and every esoteric fact about them that she knew as the goddess of the hunt. The frown deepened as she remembered everything relevant to what Zoe had told her. When Artemis opened her eyes, they were filled with stormy resolution. She then said, "Zoe, what you and your quest companions witnessed was a monster becoming an archetype and gaining a monster's style of immortality. Such a thing hasn't occurred in millennia. I'm not surprised you didn't know what you observed, since such occurrences are extremely rare, and the last one occurred centuries before you joined the hunt. Most monsters are either born as monstrous archetypes or were transformed into one by God. What is even more concerning is the fact that this Heptad group was able to create a new monster, and even do so without any of us knowing about it. I trust that I don't have to tell you just how dangerous this is, Zoe?" The lieutenant nodded her head in full agreement. Even if Cybertor's creation would turn out to be cost-prohibitive or require significant mystical backing of some sort, the fact that mortals had created a real monster in the true sense changed everything. It would have a psychological effect on Olympus somewhat on the order of what the 9/11 event was having on the mortals of the United States, but on a much grander scale. The only reason Artemis wasn't freaking out over the news Zoe had given her was she had already had several massive paradigm changes over the past few years. After a short pause, Artemis continued to speak. "Beyond the effects this knowledge will have on Olympus, I am very concerned about Cybertor itself. A monster with its capacities will be extremely dangerous for the hunt and for the half-bloods." Artemis made a mental note to cash in the favor from Tartarus she got from Persephone so that she could be notified the instant Cybertor reformed. She needed to get the monster's measure to know what changes she'd have to make in the hunt's training. From Zoe's descriptions, Artemis was afraid that she'd have to focus the hunt's training on barrier seals, which would necessitate a completely new mindset for the hunt. "So Zoe, how has the quest been for you besides uncovering several world-shattering revelations? From what little I have heard, it sounds like this quest of Naruto's is turning up to be very different than most other quests." Artemis, like every other Olympian, couldn't observe the quest on Hephaestus TV due to a ban by the fates that Hera had agreed to enforce. Not that most gods and goddesses needed Hera to enforce the ban. Very few deities were stupid or arrogant enough to try and piss off that trio. This meant that she had to find out what was going on with the old-fashioned mortal method. For the next half hour, the lieutenant told her lady about the events of the quest. Artemis was slightly surprised at how bloody the quest had been so far. Having to face a few monsters was expected, some might even say anticipated by some gods and goddesses, but quests typically weren't this bloody. Ares would probably be in hog heaven once he heard how the quest was going. That is, if he didn't try to rail against Hera for keeping him from watching. The fact that dozens of mortals were involved caused an eyebrow to be raised by the goddess. Mortals had been involved in quests before, some had even led quests like Hera's first champion Jason of the Argonauts. But such things had not happened in quests for a long time. The last time a mortal had been involved with a quest was in the 60s, and the last time a large group of mortals was involved in quests was the Crusades. However, the biggest shock to Artemis was when Zoe mentioned the adoption papers that Naruto had shown her. Naruto hadn't mentioned the idea to her yet, so this was completely out of the blue, and she wasn't sure how she felt about it. On the one hand, it was an incredibly touching and dear thought to Artemis. She loved each of her hunters as if they were her own flesh and blood. The thought of being able to call them her daughters was a thought that filled her with happiness. Artemis was fairly certain that she could successfully argue against her spending time with the hunt if they were adopted as her children. She might want to prep a few things first before signing everything just to be on the safe side, but it shouldn't be too hard. Aphrodite would probably be her biggest threat on that front, and several of the gods who might be able to help the slut in an attack on that angle weren't too thrilled with the said slut. On the other hand, part of her was annoyed that Naruto had gotten things set up so far as he had. Shouldn't this have been something that the two of them talked about before Naruto typed up the paperwork? Sure, the paperwork in question couldn't be official until after their marriage, and she signed them, which would at least be a couple of years. That's also not counting the fact that any such document would need the clan's seal, and Artemis had that as Naruto's pledge. However, adoption was kind of a major thing for couples, and the fates better have mercy on her idiot fiancé if he thought he could just make a decision like that on his own. His status as the best option for her as a husband would not protect him from being shoved into the doghouse by her after she dragged him over the coals. She was also furious that she was finding out about this from Zoe instead of Naruto himself. Granted, Naruto had revealed it to Zoe in order to comfort her. She also couldn't judge just how long Naruto was planning to do something like this. He could have been planning this for months and slowly wrote up the paperwork, or he could have come up with it during the quest, and had his clones draw up the documents during one of his shifts as a guard. Those clones of his made judging the amount of time Naruto spent on a project tricky at best. Then there was the fact that only Naruto and maybe Hera knew everything that he kept sealed on himself at all times or had specifically packed for this quest. After almost a minute of silence, Artemis came to a decision. She had to question Naruto about the adoption papers once he and Zoe got back from their quest. If he had come up with the idea on the spot and had simply let his enthusiasm get the better of him, then she'd give her future husband a stern talking to. However, if he had been prepping this for months, then his ass was grass. Oh, the goddess wouldn't kill him, but by the time she would be through with him, her husband-to-be would have the golden commandment of marriage burned into his brain. Never ever do anything major or important without first consulting and getting the approval of one's wife. Zoe returned to the rented motel rooms where the trio were staying after she finished speaking to Artemis. Naruto had arranged for the trio to get 2 rooms next to each other. Naturally, Zoe got one cramped room to herself while the boys got the other room. Bucephalus and Skullsplitter were both staying in a penned-in area that the motel had set up for animals. The huntress entered the boys' room and was surprised to see a third person in the room with Naruto and Issei. The third person in the room was an older man of African descent in his mid-40s, dressed in a respectable business suit. It was easy for Zoe to spot the hidden pistol that the man was carrying under his suit coat. She was slightly surprised when she sensed a faint mystical charm on one of the man's pens. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Was this person a messenger from Heptad? Naruto gave Zoe a smile and said, "Welcome back, Zoe. Let me introduce you to Dr. Raymond Langston, MD from the CSI division of Las Vegas and an alumni of Camp Half-Blood." That news was relaxing for Zoe since it meant that they likely weren't about to have to fight again. She gave Dr. Langston a questioning look for a moment, as she tried to mentally ditch his looks and see if she could remember him from the Hunt's occasional stops back then at camp. She then said in a slightly unsure tone, "You were a member of Cabin 11. If I remember right, you were one of the claimed campers in that cabin whose divine parent was one of the non-council member deities." "Sorry, but I don't remember anything more about you, Dr. Langston." Raymond gave the lieutenant a small smile and a polite nod of the head. "I am honored that you remembered that much about me, Miss Nightshade. Most people don't tend to remember the children of Morpheus, as a few of my siblings can tell you. Of course, as a huntress you are looking as young as ever." The older half-blood's face hardened as he turned to look at the trio. "Now, would the 3 of you mind telling me why I have an 85-man massacre of a crime scene that is so heavily ridden with mist that I am going to have to become extremely creative with in order to sanitize it from mortal consumption? There had better be an extremely good explanation for this, as my time is better spent tracking down criminals that I can send to jail. Let me promise you that if your reason is not good enough in my mind, I will ensure that the 3 of you suffer nightmares the likes of which you cannot imagine for the rest of my life." Naruto spoke up. "Sorry for creating such a headache for you. We didn't want to do that to you. We're on a quest from the Fates to stop a massive threat to Western society. The details of our quest are being kept out of regular half-blood circulation by necessity. However, I can share a few facts with you that should make your job easier. That base we hit today was being used by the group that is behind the threat that the Fates sent us to deal with. This group is using mortals to advance its agenda when it is able. Finally, the mortals recruited wanted to commit terrorist actions against the United States, and were under the mist-supported illusion that they were here to launch a nuclear attack." Raymond's face paled when Naruto mentioned a nuclear attack. That was a threat to his city that he couldn't deal with. It was a threat that no half-blood could deal with. Stop a plot to use such a weapon? That he could potentially do if he got wind of it. If the mortals at his latest crime scene wanted to use a nuclear weapon on Las Vegas, then it was a good thing that the young questers had disposed of them. Raymond's only regret now was that someone as young as the boys had to deal with having that much blood on their hands. The half-blood doctor composed himself and said, "I see that the situation did in fact merit the outcome. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a lot of work ahead of me to get everything set for mortals. Also, if you can please try to keep the body count down the next time you're in town." Las Vegas has enough problems without a mystical murder spree occurring. Chapter 35. Morning came for the trio sooner than they would have liked. Zoe woke up and quickly hit the books translating part of the recovered files from Heptad. Issei watered the trio's rides and picked up breakfast at a nearby Denny's. Naruto was on the phone with Dr. Raymond Langston informing his fellow half-blood of everything that the trio had altered with the mist, and how they altered it. The doctor needed that information to finish making everything at the former Heptad base kosher for mortals. Issei arrived back at his and Naruto's room carrying breakfast just as Naruto finished his conversation with Dr. Langston. He put Zoe's meal on the bed near where she was sitting with a dozen different books spread out. Then he put the other two meals on the table where Naruto was sitting next to the phone that the shinobi had just been using. Naruto grabbed his order and opened. He then selected 2 of the 3 strips of bacon and set them off to the side. A quick glance at Zoe revealed that she had set aside one of her sausage links. The duo looked at each other for a second, glanced at the overhead fire sprinkler, and then back to each other. Within a second of each other they both said, "Outside after breakfast." The last thing they wanted to do was trigger the fire alarm since they had no idea how sensitive it was. At least with the dinner yesterday they had the candles to judge. The next 7 minutes were filled with the mute noises of the trio eating their breakfasts. Once breakfast was finished, Naruto unsealed his portable altar and picked the reserved pieces of bacon. Zoe followed Naruto while holding her selection of sausage in a napkin. Issei rolled his eyes as his companions left to make their morning offerings. About 3 minutes later, Zoe and Naruto returned to the motel room and resumed their previous seats. Naruto then spoke up, "So Zoe, were you able to figure out what Heptad is planning on doing next from the info we swiped, or do you need more time?" Zoe frowned and said, "I'd like a little more time to double-check some things. If what I'm reading is correct, then the extra time will not be a problem. It seems that Heptad's current plan is to use another Half-Blood's quest to bring the Yata no Kagami into contact with a powerful god or goddess. Apparently, their leadership feels that using it to cause as much chaos and disaster in the mystical world is the best way to salvage their ambitions now that someone is on to them. However, I want to double-check a few things because I'm not entirely sure if I'm looking at a code hidden in a few spots or it's simply some differences in the dialect they're using compared to what I'm used to reading." Issei cut in at this point with his 2 cents. "If that's the case, then I suppose we better let you get back to your books. Naruto and I don't know Arabic, so we can't help you on that issue. While you work on that, I'm going to go and brush Skullsplitter's coat." After Issei left, Naruto pulled out his judgment book and started to add the recent deaths from the Heptad base to the black book. A scowl appeared on Naruto's face when he looked at where he was adding the new names, or in many cases general descriptions, of his latest kills. There would only be a few blank pages in the back of his book by the time he finished his current new entries. This quest had been adding way too many entries to his judgment book. At this rate, he'd need to get a second judgment book started before the quest ended. The thought of having to have another judgment book made Naruto sick to his stomach. Jiraiya had been working on his 5th judgment book when he had been killed. Naruto hoped to never have that many judgment books to his name. After all, part of the reason why Jiraiya had so many kills to his name was because he fought in the 2nd and 3rd Shinobi Wars. At the rate Naruto had been adding names to his judgment book before coming to Earth, he wouldn't have reached this point until he was in his late 30s. Later that day, Naruto headed to a nearby park that had a small fountain in it. The fountain was currently turned off to conserve water in the heat wave the city was dealing with. Naruto looked around at the various mortals and then began to slowly manipulate the mist. A look of concentration set itself on the shinobi's face as he slowly got the mortals to leave this area of the park and then not look at it. Once Naruto was sure he wouldn't cause a scene, he created a shadow clone. A quick check revealed that none of the mortals had noticed what he had done. The clone then took over maintaining the mist manipulations to keep the mortals at bay. Naruto proceeded to unseal 3 large barrels of water from a scroll he had been carrying. He quickly put the barrels next to the fountain and then climbed into the fountain. The shinobi was once again thankful for those damned D-ranked missions he had been forced to do as a new genin. They might have been aggravating as Tartarus, and almost as painful when it came to the Torah missions, but they gave genin a wide range of skills that were useful in odd situations. Currently, Naruto put his plumbing skills to work so that one of the spouts in the fountain would turn on once it had water. He then got out of the fountain and quickly poured the contents of the 3 barrels into it. It took a few seconds for the fountain to start shooting up water. A little while after that, enough spray started to form for an IM to be sent. The ninja pulled out a drachma and said, "Please accept this offering, Goddess Iris, and let me speak to one of the staff in charge at Camp Half-Blood." He then tossed the coin into mist where it disappeared in a small flash. Since Naruto didn't specify who exactly he wanted to speak to, Iris decided to put Artemis on the IM. Through the misty view, Naruto saw Artemis from her side giving some instructions to campers and putting away their archery gear. Once she was done giving her instructions, the goddess turned around to look at Naruto. There was a flash of irritation on her face for a moment before she was able to set her face in a more neutral tone. Artemis then asked, "Yes, Naruto, why are you calling camp while you're on your quest?" Naruto quickly replied, "I'm calling to check up on something. Has Percy left on his quest to find my mother's diadem yet?" The question surprised Artemis slightly as she answered, "Yes, he has. In fact, he, Annabeth, and the satyr left with Argus to start the quest 10 minutes ago. I can recall them if you absolutely need it for something, but I recommend against such a move." Left unsaid was the fact that such a move would kick up a hornet's nest among the gods even under the best of circumstances. Considering who Naruto's mom was, who Percy's patron was, and what happening for the past couple of months delaying Percy's quest on Naruto request fell under absolutely terrible circumstances. Naruto shook his head. "That is not necessary, Artemis, but thanks for the offer. Zoe's figured out the next clue on our quest, and it looks like the ones who stole the item the Fates sent me after are planning on using it to interfere with Percy's quest. I just need to know where he's heading so that the others and I can plan our next move." Artemis nodded her head with a faint look of worry temporarily appearing on her face. Mixing quests usually resulted in problems, and it was vital that these two quests succeed. The goddess then said, "Percy and his group are heading towards Los Angeles. For some reason, the oracle's prophecy implied that the Lord of the Dead is involved in the loss of Hera's diadem. Personally, I find this hard to believe. However, Chiron seems to think this, and it is the only clue that Percy has to work on at the moment." Where Percy was heading was a bit of a surprise to Naruto. However, he wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth since Percy's journey would almost certainly bring him close to Naruto's quest group. Naruto smiled at Artemis and replied, "Thanks for the heads up. Is there anything else I need to know?" Artemis thought for a moment, and then created what looked like a snap-activated glow stick. The glow stick started to glow in a silver-white light for a second before it vanished from her hand and appeared in Naruto's. Artemis then said, "There is something I want to talk to you about, but now is not the appropriate time. Tonight when you get the chance, go outside by yourself and turn on that glow stick. I'll be able to see it while I'm driving the moon and then we can talk." The goddess then turned her head and said, "Iris, end this message now." With that said, Artemis's image in the misty vision disappeared along with all the mystical aspects of the fountain spray. Naruto then proceeded to reseal the empty barrels back into their scroll. He then looked at the water sitting in the fountain and shook his head. There was no jutsu in his arsenal that would let him pour the water back into the barrels he had just sealed. His control of water jutsus just wasn't that good. He also couldn't just use a jutsu to cause the water to leave the fountain in a harmless manner since he didn't know a jutsu like that. Any water jutsu that Naruto could use would likely cause some property damage and would be very hard to explain away with the mist. The only option to explain away the water was to manipulate the mist to make it seem like someone had been playing with the fountain's plumbing, and this water was the result. While Naruto was talking to Artemis, Zoe was spending her time doing routine maintenance on her bow and arrows near Bucephalus and Skull Splitter. Issei was lying hog-tied on the ground about 2 feet away from the mount's bowls of water. Both northern mystical creatures would occasionally glance at the bound aunts, and smirks momentarily seemed to form on their faces. Issei let out a pathetic groan and pleaded with the hunter. "Please let me go, Zoe. It's not like I'm going to cause anyone any harm. Seriously, I wasn't even going to use the weave to get around paying an entrance fee. Don't you think that all of this is going way overboard? I promise I'll be back in 2 hours, and it's not like we've got to move out immediately." A twitch appeared on Zoe's face and she put her arrow down to avoid damaging it due to improper sharpening. She then turned her head slightly and gave the back of Issei's head a murderous glare as she spoke. "Not a chance in the underworld while we are on this quest, Issei. If I release you from your bonds, you'll head straight for that bordello." The bound boy cut her off and said, "It's a titty bar, not a bordello. What is wrong about seeing the good looks that the gods have blessed mortals with when that beauty is put on display for people to see?" Issei then started to go into perverted fantasies over the massive beautiful breasts that were no doubt on display at this very moment. Shortly after these fantasies started, they and consciousness were taken from Issei by a rock to the back of his head. Zoe got up, walked over the unconscious pervert, and picked up her sharpening stone that she had gently thrown. The hunter double-checked the stone to make sure there weren't any problems with continuing to use it as a sharpening stone. She pocketed the stone since she didn't want to risk losing it. It was a good sharpening stone, and it did take a while to find a good one when a replacement was needed. Then, in a restrained manner, Zoe gave Issei a kick to the stomach for being an example of a worthless male. Before Zoe could get back to sharpening her arrows, she heard the sound of someone walking towards her and her unconscious teammate. The hunter turned her head and moved her hand to a hidden knife on her person. She relaxed slightly when she saw that Naruto was the person approaching the duo, and relaxed even more when she saw Naruto blink his eyes in a quick pattern they had talked about earlier. Part of Zoe was used to the idea of secondary passcode to confirm identity, since the kind of deception that would necessitate such security was rare in the mythical world. Such things were common in Naruto's world, even if he was more combat-focused and didn't really pay attention to those sorts of security measures when he was a fresh genin. Naruto took one look at the tied-up and unconscious Issei and shook his head in disappointment. He was only gone for 45 minutes max, and Issei could control himself for that long. Naruto took one look at the hunter and said, "Let me guess. He wanted to go to one of the seedier entertainment centers in the city?" Zoe gave a curt nod of her head, and then started back on sharpening her arrows. Naruto thought about telling about what Artemis told him about Percy's quest. However, a glance told him that Zoe needed to calm down a bit before they could talk about it. That was fine, since it should take Percy several days to get near their location. They could talk when Zoe was calm. Actually, it made a bit of sense to wait until Issei rejoined them, so then Naruto wouldn't have to tell them the same facts twice. Speaking of Issei, Naruto got an idea on how to pass the time. He unsealed some blank paper and his ink writing set. The physically young shinobi sat down for a moment with his supplies in hand and closed his eyes to think. It had been over 5 years since he had last made the seal he was thinking of, and he needed a moment to remember all of the details. The seal in question was actually his first original creation. Jiraiya had wanted to label it an S-rank forbidden seal, but Tsunade had refused to do so with a smirk on her face. With all of the details fresh in his mind, Naruto quickly went to work making the seal. From start to finish, the seal only took about 5 minutes for Naruto to create. A small smile appeared on the shinobi's face as he remembered the last time he used this particular seal. Jiraiya hadn't been able to figure out if he should be impressed or completely pissed off with the seal had been used on him by Naruto. Zoe saw the smile on Naruto's face and asked, "What have you created?" Naruto turned to look at the hunter and grinned. "This, Zoe, is my solution for dealing with Issei while we camp here in Las Vegas. While I want us to get some team training in during our downtime, which I will talk more about once sleeping hentai wakes up, I know that we can't train 24/7. This seal here will allow us to let Issei have his own fun in the city and ensure that he comes back when he's supposed to return." A look of disgust appeared on Zoe's face at the thought of letting Issei have his time in the filth this cesspit masquerading as a city called entertainment. There had been worse places for a hunter to visit, but Vegas definitely ranked in the top 10 list of cities to avoid if possible for her. She definitely was not thrilled at the idea of questing with someone who would be trying to have as much fun in this city as possible. Issei was barely tolerable now, and any time in the city would most likely make him even more difficult to deal with. This was not blind prejudice speaking, but personal experience that she had acquired over many centuries. Still, part of Zoe was curious about what Naruto had in mind. She raised an eyebrow and asked, "And just how is this seal of yours supposed to keep Issei in line if we were to let him into the city on his own? His self-control is barely above 0 as it is. Letting him indulge in the city's vices will only make his self-control worse." Naruto grinned and said, "That is where this seal comes into play, Zoe. Once I slap it on Issei, only I as the seal's maker can turn it off. This seal has an inbuilt variable timer that I can set to any time I desire. 5 minutes until the timer runs out, the person that the seal is on will start to feel a bad itch. This itch gets worse the closer the timer gets to 0. When the timer gets to 0, the seal will cause whoever it is on to start releasing particularly loud and smelly farts every 7 seconds. 5 minutes after the farting starts, the seal will start igniting the farts. It won't cause Issei's clothes or himself to catch on fire, but the ignited farts will not be pleasant. Trust me, I used this seal on a self-proclaimed super pervert, and even he couldn't last more than 9 minutes after the seal reached 0. The thought about what such a seal could do to Issei put a smile on Zoe's face. She had dealt with several heroes in the past that she would love to have a way to quarrel them like that. Humiliation and a little pain were far more effective means of busting heroes with exaggerated self-importance down to size. Even that hero had supposedly been easier to deal with for a while after he was forced to wear a dress and act as a queen's handmaiden for a few years as punishment. Sadly, that all ended when he got several more quests under his belt and regained that ego of his that he got for completing his 12 labors. Zoe then shook her head and said, "Well, I guess that will solve one problem. Hopefully, most of the other problems we will face will also be solved." That night Naruto walked up the side of the motel the trio was staying at and double-checked to make sure that he couldn't be observed. Naruto then manipulated the mist to ensure that mortals wouldn't disturb him. Once Naruto was satisfied with his security measures, he turned to look at the moon in the sky. With Artemis's chariot constantly in view, Naruto reached into his pocket, pulled out the glow stick that the goddess had given him earlier, and activated it as he held it up to the sky. There was a small and soft circular pulse of silvery energy from the now silver glowing glow stick that lasted for a few seconds. Naruto could hear a hum coming from glow stick that started to get louder and faster, almost as if it was tracking something. Then the circular pulse of light disappeared and a large beam of silver energy shot out of the glow stick straight towards the moon. Seconds after the beam of energy left the glow stick, Naruto heard the sound of someone lightly stepping onto the roof behind him. He turned around and saw Artemis standing on the roof near him. The shinobi was a bit surprised when he saw Artemis, since she was dressed in a silvery hunting dress of the style she favored back in the heroic age of ancient Greece. The only modern aspect of Artemis's outfit was a scrunchie holding her hair in a ponytail. A closer examination would have revealed that the scrunchie had been hastily put on, but Naruto didn't pick up on those clues. He quickly blurted out, "That was quick, Artemis." Artemis had a small smirk on her face when she heard that comment. She then replied with a bit of mirth in her voice, "No one ever caught anything on a hunt by having a long response time." The mirth disappeared as the goddess continued to speak. "Thank you for activating that glow stick promptly like I asked, Naruto. I won't go into details, but without you inviting me to talk with you as you did, we might not have the time needed to talk about what I want to talk to you about while you're on this quest." There were a lot of rules, regulations, and even customs that gods and goddesses had to keep in mind when dealing with half-bloods on quests. Furthermore, the circumstances varied greatly from quest to quest depending on whose children the half-bloods were, what the quest was about, and which deity felt the need to involve themselves in the quest. Any god or goddess who broke these rules could suffer a wide variety of problems, ranging from fines to even starting feuds with other deities. Since Naruto was the first half-blood of Hera on the first quest issued by the Fates themselves, the situation was murky to say the least. However, there was a loophole in this mess of proceedings, as there always seems to be in complicated legal matters if one knows where to look for it. A god or goddess could talk with a questing hero for as long as they wished without causing any problems if the hero in question asked to talk to them.